A sheaf of wheat, a slab of bacon, raw, uncooked. That's it. That's the entire delivery. Autumn 1210, a royal castle in the south of England. 2 items carried across the courtyard, through a low door, down into a locked room. The door shuts behind them. It will not open again for 11 days. There are 2 people inside that room, and that bundle is not a ration. Nobody weighed it against the days ahead, because nobody intends there to be days ahead. A sheaf of wheat, a piece of raw pig fat. This is what the English crown looks like when it decides an account is closed. The woman in that room is Maud de Braose. In the documents, Matilda de Saint-Valery, wife of William de Braose, Lord of Bramber. 3 years earlier, her family held more castles than almost any baronial house in England, Wales and Ireland. The young man locked in with her is her oldest son, William, heir to all of it, married into the Earls of Clare, father of 4 boys, and the man who ordered that door sealed? King John of England. The king her husband served for 10 years as his most trusted enforcer. The king who owed this family, and owed them for work he desperately needed the world to forget. So here's what this story has to answer. How does a dynasty this armoured get legally erased in 3 years? Why was the weapon not a sword, not a verdict, but an unpaid bill? And what did one sentence, spoken by Maud, out loud, to the wrong men, have to do with a 16-year-old prince who walked into a castle at Rouen in 1203 and never walked out? 3 threads. They tie together at a riverside meadow called Runnymede. Everything you're about to hear rests on records left by people with direct access to these events, including, and this is rare, a written statement by the killer himself. Where the records disagree or go quiet, I'll tell you straight. Start with the map. Bramber on the Sussex coast, then west, along the Welsh frontier, Abergavenny, Brecon, Bilth, Radnor, Hay, the 3 castles of Gwent, across the sea, the honour of Limerick in Ireland, and back over the channel, the family's home seat at Briouze in Normandy. Every one of those names is a fortress, and by 1205, every single one of them answers to William de Braose. He didn't inherit that empire. He built it through marriage, through royal favour, and through methods the Welsh never forgot. The Brut y Tywysgogion, the chronicle of the Welsh princes, records what happened at Abergavenny at Christmas, 1175. William invited a Welsh lord, Cecil ap Dyfnwal, and his men to a feast, under his roof, under his protection, and had them killed at the table. So no, this is not a story about an innocent family. This is a story about what the crown could do to a guilty one, and to the woman standing next to it. Because the other half of this empire was Maud. We have exactly one contemporary description of her. It comes from an anonymous chronicler writing in French in the 1220s, a man tied to the household of Bethune, who knew these people personally. He calls her wise and vigorous, and he adds, his detail not mine, that she personally kept up the war on the Welsh frontier, and won. Welsh tradition went further. It turned her into Moll Woolby, the giantess who built Hay Castle in a single night, carrying the stones in her apron. That's legend, and it should be labelled as legend. But folklore doesn't grow around quiet women. Maud ran the estates, ran the garrisons, negotiated at the highest level. And when the end came, the crown treated her, not her husband, as the head that had to come off. So that's the family at its peak, a private empire on 3 coastlines, a lord who dines with the king, a lady the Welsh tell monster stories about. What takes that apart in 3 years? The answer was already on the books, literally. Here's how power actually worked in King John's England, the part the Robin Hood version leaves out. Every great acquisition was bought on credit. A baron didn't just receive a lordship, he bid for it, like an auction, and the debt went onto the pipe rolls, the great parchment ledgers of the royal exchequer. In 1201, William de Braose bid 5,000 marks for the honour of Limerick. Was he expected to pay it off? No. Nobody was. That was the design. Because the point of the system was never repayment, The point was leverage. Think of the exchequer rolls as a deterrence arsenal. Warheads that are never meant to be fired, only aimed. As long as a baron behaved, his debts slept. The moment he displeased the king, the crown could demand the full balance immediately, with his lands and castles as collateral. And contemporaries had a name for what happened then: the king's ira et malevolentia, his anger and ill will. That phrase sits in the royal records themselves. The historian J.E.A. Jolliffe built a whole study of Angevin kingship around it. Falling into the king's ill will wasn't an emotion, it was a financial event. By 1207, John's clerks were quietly recalculating what William de Braose owed. The Limerick payments were years behind. On paper, the richest frontier lord in the realm was also one of its most exposed debtors. The weapon was loaded and aimed. It just needed a reason to fire, and the reason had been sitting in this family's memory for 4 years. It had a name, a title, and a grave nobody was allowed to know about. Arthur of Brittany was King John's nephew, the son of John's dead older brother, which made the boy, in the eyes of the King of France and half of Europe, the rightful heir to everything John held. August 1202. 15-year-old Arthur makes the mistake of besieging his own grandmother at a castle called Meadow. John force marches an army and hits the siege from behind. Total surprise, and the man credited with physically capturing Arthur, the man who put his hands on the prince and delivered him to the king, was William de Braose. Arthur goes to Falaise, then to the castle of Rouen, and in April 1203, he's gone. No trial, no announced death, no grave. The official silence is total, and it stays total for the rest of John's reign. But one document refused to stay silent: the Annals of Margam Abbey in Glamorgan, a monastery that lived on de Braose money, whose monks prayed for the de Braose dead. And in those annals sits the most precise account of Arthur's fate written anywhere in that generation. The Margam annalist states that on the 3rd of April, 1203, after dinner, King John, drunk and, in the annalist's words, possessed by the devil, killed the boy with his own hand, tied a heavy stone to the body, and threw it into the Seine. A fisherman's net brought it back up. The body was recognised and buried quietly at a priory nearby, out of fear of the king. Now honestly, how much can we trust that entry? Margam's monks were the family's monks. Their information almost certainly travelled the same roads their donations did. They were not neutral, and this was not testimony under oath. But that connection is exactly what makes the entry extraordinary. Detail like that comes from proximity, and the one man in this story with proximity, Arthur's captor, John's daily companion, was William de Braose. Modern historians from F. M. Powick onward have said it openly, and it is a modern conclusion, not a medieval statement. The Margam account reads like the de Braose family's private knowledge, written down where the king couldn't reach it. For 5 years that knowledge just sat there. The family stayed in favour, the debt stayed asleep, the arrangement held. It took exactly one sentence to blow it up. It's 1208, John has quarrelled with the Pope, England is under interdict, and the king trusts no one. His response? Hostages. He demands the sons of the barons he suspects, handed over as living guarantees of their father's loyalty. Royal officers ride out across the country to collect them. They arrive at the de Braose gates. They ask for Maud's sons, and Maud answers, not privately, not diplomatically. Within earshot of the king's own officers, she says, as the chronicler Roger of Wendover records it, that she will not surrender her sons to a king who had murdered his own nephew. One sentence, out loud, to men whose entire job is to repeat it. In modern military terms, that's a catastrophic breach of operational security. Not because the information was new. Every baron in England privately suspected what happened at Rouen. Suspicion the king could live with. What he could not live with was this: the one family that actually knew, the family of the man who captured Arthur, the family whose own abbey had already written down the date, the method and the river, saying it on the record. Quick word on the source. Wendover was a monk of St. Albans, writing after John was safely dead, and he hated the king. His dialogue is reconstruction, not a transcript. But what happens next is not reconstruction. What happens next is in the Crown's own financial and military records. And it is exactly what you'd expect if that sentence, or something very close to it, was really said. The debts wake up. The exchequer demands the arrears on Limerick and everything else, in full. Royal officers move to seize the de Braouze castles as collateral. William tries a desperate counter-move, an armed raid to take back his own fortresses. It fails. By 1209, the family that owned the Middlemarch of Wales is running. They cross to Ireland, to Trim Castle, where their daughter Margaret is married into the de Lacy family, and Ireland's great magnates do something remarkable. They shelter them, for nearly 2 years, in open defiance of their king. So in the summer of 1210, John does something no English king had done in decades. He leads a full royal army to Ireland, not to fight the Irish, to hunt one baronial family and punish everyone who helped it. Carrickfergus falls. The de Lacys are stripped of their lands and driven into exile. Maud and her son run north with a small party, take ship and make for Scotland by way of the Isle of Man. And on the Galloway coast they are caught by a Scottish lord named Duncan of Carrick, who knows exactly what his catch is worth. He sells them back to John. They come south in chains, back to Carrickfergus, into the hands of the king they've spent 2 years running from. Her husband isn't with them. William de Braouze the elder has slipped away to Wales, then to France. The lord of a dozen castles is now a fugitive who owns what he is standing in, and the king holds his wife and his heir. Which raises the question this whole system was built to answer. What's the price? There is a price, and we know it because the negotiation is documented by the king's own side. Bristol, late summer 1210. Maud, a prisoner, her husband a fugitive, her son in chains beside her, negotiates with the Crown of England and agrees to a settlement, 40,000 marks, for the king's grace, for her life, for her husband's pardon. 40,000 marks is 6.4 million silver pennies, the only coin England even minted. If you stacked them on scales, you'd be looking at roughly 9 tons of silver, 8 times what the entire honour of Limerick had cost. Numbers like that were never really meant to be paid. They were meant to turn a person into a permanent debtor, alive at the king's pleasure. But as a settlement, it looks like an ending. A fine agreed, a pardon on the table, a famously wealthy family. This is the shape of a ransom story, and ransom stories end with a release. Except the money never comes. Her husband, hunted across 2 kingdoms, can't raise it, or can't reach it. The first instalment fails, and under the rules Maud has just signed, there is no appeal, no court, no judgment of her peers. There is only the ledger. The account moves to collection. Even here, the records disagree, and you deserve to see the disagreement, not have it smoothed over. The chroniclers name 2 castles, Windsor and Corfe in Dorset. The most detailed account, the same Bethune writer who admired Maud's vigour, says Corfe. Others say Windsor. 800 years on, we cannot certify the room. What no source disputes is what was done in it. Mother and son are put into one cell. The door is sealed. And the chronicler records the provisioning order with terrible precision. A sheaf of wheat, 1 piece of raw bacon, the objects from the start of this video. Nothing else. No water mentioned, no bread, no second delivery. That bundle isn't food, it's arithmetic, the smallest possible quantity that lets everyone involved say the prisoners were not, technically, given nothing. And if that sounds like a lawyer's math to you, That is exactly what it is. On the 11th day, the door is opened. Both are dead. The chronicler sets down the position they were found in, Maud sitting upright between her son's legs, her head fallen back against his chest. And one further detail, which he records flatly, and which I will say once, the same way. In the extremity of her hunger, she had gnawed at her dead son's cheeks. One honest caution. That death scene comes from a single source, written in France, roughly a decade later, by a man hostile to John. No English record describes the cell, and the scene may carry the polish of a story retold. But the deaths themselves are not in doubt, in any source, hostile or royal. The family's fall is stamped across the crown's own rolls, and starvation, as John's method, appears again elsewhere in his reign. Whatever happened behind that door took about 11 days, and no one intervened. So why is there no royal record of the deaths? Because as far as the crown was concerned, nothing irregular had occurred. And we know that. This is the part that separates this story from every other medieval atrocity. We know it because the king put it in writing. Around September 1210, King John dictated, in council, a formal public statement of his side of the de Braose affair, a queremonia, a complaint. A copy survives in the Black Book of the Exchequer, the Treasury's own register. In it, the king walks through the entire relationship as an accounting story. The sums William owed, the instalments missed, the settlement Maud agreed at Bristol, the default, and he closes on the point that for John settled everything. He had proceeded against them according to the custom of our kingdom and by the law of our exchequer. There it is, the whole mechanism, signed by its operator, not a murder confessed, a foreclosure documented. The historian David Crouch, who edited the text, points out that it was framed for wide circulation. The king expected criticism from his barons and moved to get ahead of it. Taken the way John intended, it's a routine debt collection memo. Placed next to a sheaf of wheat, it is the closest thing the Middle Ages ever produced to a starvation with a paper trail. The strangest word in that document is law, and the sentence is true. That's the horror. Everything John did to this family was, by the rules he administered, procedurally correct. So what does it mean when the paperwork is in order and the mother and son are dead? That's not a modern question. That is exactly the question John's barons asked, and their answer changed legal history. The husband first. William de Braouze the elder outlived his wife by less than a year. He died at Corfe outside Paris in August 1211, a ruined exile in the kingdom of his king's worst enemy. His son Giles, the Bishop of Hereford, sat out the reign in French exile. Maud's 4 grandsons, the children of the young man who starved beside her, were held in royal custody as children. They were not released until 1218. John had been dead for 2 years, and every magnate in England absorbed the same lesson at the same moment. The richest, best connected, most loyal servant of the crown had just been converted into a corpse and a ledger entry, without a single judgment being passed. Sidney Painter, the great American biographer of the reign, called the destruction of the de Braoses John's greatest mistake. Not because it failed, because it succeeded, in full view of every man John would one day need. 5 years after that door was sealed, those men stood over King John in a meadow at Runnymede and made him seal a charter, clause 39 of Magna Carta. No free man shall be seized, or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. The law of the land, set deliberately against the law of the exchequer. The barons of 1215 were writing rules of engagement for their own king, and legal historians, going back to J.C. Holt's classic study of the Charter, have read the de Braose case as one of the specific horrors behind that clause. Because what it bans almost point by point is this: arrest without judgment, ruin by ledger, death by administrative procedure. Maud's destruction didn't cause Magna Carta by itself, but when the drafters needed to name the thing that must never be lawful again, they were describing her. And there is one last document, the strangest of all. October 1216. King John is dying at Newark, his kingdom half lost to civil war. 8 days before his death, letters patent go out, granting land in the royal forest of Achenbury to Margaret de Lacy, Maud's daughter, for the founding of a religious house, where prayers would be said for the souls of her father, her mother, her brother. The king signed off on a priory built to pray for the family he destroyed. Conscience, politics, a dying man balancing his accounts. The parchment doesn't say, which brings this story back one last time to a sheaf of wheat and a piece of raw bacon. In 1210, those two objects were the closing entry on an account, the crown's way of ending a file. Instead, a chronicler wrote them down. A treasury clerk copied the king's self-justification into the permanent record, and together they became the opposite of a closed file. They became the evidence. The signs of this collapse were there all along, in the ledgers, in the annals of a Welsh abbey, in one sentence spoken at a gate, legible the whole time, and read only afterward. The way collapses always are. He killed them by the law of his exchequer. They answered him with the law of the land.